Good morning. Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me. I think we got everything set up. Um, uh, I think we're all good from the technical difficulties of the last couple of times we've met. This is Theology of the Laity, Disciples in the World. This is our fourth session. The fourth session is entitled Identity Kings. So today we're going to be some kings and some queens. It is going to be. I'm excited about this teaching. I'm excited about to be able to dive into this one because I think it's going to be a spin on king or a spin on queen that you have that maybe we don't think of very often. So what? Just as a couple of housekeeping things before we start, I'm going to make sure to just to draw your attention. If you had printed out the notes last week and you're looking at the same notes that we had up from last week, you might want to go and look at them again. This morning, first thing this morning, after my holy hour and doing a couple of things, I like about an hour ago, really, I changed one piece of the notes. So you may have to go online. It's really just one spot. I'll call our attention to it so you can draw it in, write it in real quick. It's like 4 words and 2 arrows. Like, it's not that much, but it is something. So if you're looking at old notes, there is one spot that's going to be a little bit off. But I'll make sure to just to point it out and make sure that we're all on the same page with it. As you know, last week we did not have our session, and really the main reason why is because I wanted to do. We were working on just making the internet and making our infrastructure, right? We were shoring it up, making it look and work as best as it possibly can. And right now we are rolling with some pretty good internet, with some pretty good ability to stream and things like that. So I think especially Mr. Dave Thomas, who just spent a lot of time here helping me out, trying to organize a few things and run some cables and things like that. And then as well as Jeff Berger, our IT guy, who comes in pretty regularly with us. Just to kind of bail me out because I know a little bit of the tech stuff, but I don't know all of the tech stuff. And these guys were champs for us this past week. But I'm excited. I'm excited that we're back. Remember, this is the 4th of 6 sessions. So we're going to have 6 total sessions for the purposes of this course. So we got 3 more to go, 3 more down the line. So that should get us right to the middle of May, and it'll be really great. So thank you though again for joining us this morning. Thanks for being with us. There's I hope the phone connections the phone connection issues. I just saw Angie post something. I hope the phone connection issues that were going on in the area, I hope they're wrapped up and fixed and figured out. So, but if not, this should be saved on whatever your. It should be saved on Facebook. It should be saved on our different platforms, YouTube, Facebook, things like that. So you should be able to pull it up. You should be able to see it at a later date if you can't see it right now. So let's jump in. Let's dive in, and let's get started for today. Oh, all right. There we go. All right. I do have, as always, I have my slides up on one side of my screen. I got my monitor up on another, and I got my my window open. So if you have questions, comments, anything like that, be sure to type in your comments into the comment section on Facebook. I'm monitoring Facebook. I will check before the end of the day. I will check YouTube to make sure that everything's good there as well. That if anybody's watching it on a smart TV or something like that, if you want to text me, if you have my number or anything like that, you can do that. And you can send it directly to me, email me, whatever. I'll get the messages while we're going. So if you have any questions, any points of clarification, because hopefully this is a big concept, right? The identity of king. So we might make a couple of jumps. We're gonna do a few different things during the course of this that I think are gonna be really interesting. But if you have any questions, if you want some clarification on stuff, please don't hesitate send me a message, ask me whatever you got to ask me. I was thinking there was something else. I kind of forgot. Oh, well, let's get started. All right. So Theology of the Laity, disciples in the world. Transition. There we go. All right. Before we jump into the disciples of the laity, theology of disciples of the laity. I'm already messed up. Theology of the laity, disciples in the world. Before we jump into our new session, let's recap our old session. So, a review from session 3, right? We were talking about prophet, right? And it might have been 2 weeks ago, and it was a little while, but let's try and work our minds back to where we were. So, review from session 3, prophet. Prophet means to speak before, right? Proclaiming the message of God in the daily social and family life. It's a very interesting. I think it's just that's what it means to be prophetic, right? It's to speak before the Lord, like to be the voice crying out in the desert of today, right? In the homes of today, in the workplaces of today. That's what it means to be a prophet, right? So the second point, we examine the various backgrounds of Old Testament prophets. Remember, we looked at Jeremiah, we looked at Ezekiel, we looked at Micah, we looked at Jonah, we looked at all these different people, and particularly their faults and their limitedness, right? If that's a word, the limits that they had in proclaiming the gospel, but God still used them, right? God still spoke through them. God still used them in expressing and forwarding his message. But we especially focused on one of the first of the Old Testament prophets, Moses, and we especially focused on one of the last of the Old Testament prophets, John the Baptist. Why? Because these are the two keys. Like, these are the two keys in reading all of the Old Testament and really in ushering in the New Testament for us, right? Third point, we got the proclamation of the gospel is a matter of both word and deed. Jesus did it that way, right? Jesus showed us the way to be a prophet, the way to be a prophetic voice, the way to call before the presence of God, right? He gives us the example, like the most excellent, right, example where he worked in word and in deed. And we as Christians, we as Catholics, right, are called to follow Jesus. If we're Christians, we're followers of Christ. We're supposed to be like Christ, where we usher in the gospel in both word and in deed. Our prophetic mission should have an impact on all spheres of life. This was the spot where we looked at John F. Kennedy's quote, where he said, "My religion is essentially he said, my religion doesn't have an impact on my politics." It should, right? Because our Catholicism, if we are Catholic, that's the disposition that we work from, right? That's the way in which our whole life is ordered. That is the ordering principle to our life. So that should have an influence on how it is that we raise our families, right? And we work in our families. That should have an influence on how we work in our workplaces. That should have an influence on how we vote. That should have an influence on how we, what we do or don't do with our social life, right? Or the way in which we buy into certain pieces of life, right? That if we are Catholic and we are formed Catholic, then that gives us basically a lens by which to look at the rest of the world and engage with the rest of the world. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that next week, especially in our mission course, right? In session 5 about mission, that's going to be a big part. That's going to be very, very practical, and it's going to be looking at these different spheres of our life. And then finally, evangelization must be done through an authentic witness and must uphold truth with love. Right? We never separate truth and love. Truth and love have to be joined. If we don't have love and we have truth, you're a jerk, right? If you're just hitting people over the head with facts and with these things, you can become a jerk very, very quickly. But if we have love without truth, then we really have a kind of a broken version of love, because, yeah, I want to accept you and I want to have compassion for you, but I don't call you to something greater. There's something broken there, right? And evangelization is most effective when it comes from an authentic witness. That was the Pope Paul VI quote, right? One of my favorites. That modern man does not listen to teachers, but listens to witnesses. And if they listen to teachers, it's because they were first witnesses, right? I use that quote multiple times with our mentors for youth formation at both St. Hilary and St. Anthony. And the reason why is because our young people today, especially the younger generations, like generation, millennials and south, right? Millennials and iGen and everyone else behind them, they can smell BS from a mile away. If you don't believe it, they can call it, right? They're gonna call you on it, and they're not gonna just be quickly trusting. They're not gonna be easily swayed one way or the other. So for us, it's a challenge, right? And not just to young people, but to all people, that if we're going to proclaim the gospel, we have to believe what we're proclaiming, right? And we have to be practicing what we believe, right? And if we're not, then it's going to probably fall on deaf ears, right? So we need to be a witness, and then we need to have both truth and love together. Today, though, as we dive into this teaching, as we dive into today's session, we're going to be looking at King, right? So as we started off every class to this point, we're baptized into Christ's identity, priest, prophet, and king, right? And again, I'm going to go with the quote from the Second Vatican Council. As sharers in the role of Christ as priest, prophet, and king, the laity have their work cut out for them in the life and activity of the church. Their activity is so necessary within the church communities that without it, the apostolate of pastors is often unable to achieve its full effectiveness. You are an integral part to the life and the mission of the church as a layperson, right? So often lay people are just kind of like, oh yeah, they're the bystanders, or they're the spectators on Sunday. No. The church does not exist. The church to its fullest. The church does not do its work to its fullest without the influence and the activity of the laity. Right, and so that's the purpose of this whole course. That's been kind of our thesis statement for this whole course. And me as a pastor, quite honestly, I need some help in the trenches, right? And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to give, hopefully, this entire course, these last 3 sessions especially, is just shining a light on who it is that God is empowering you to be by virtue of your baptism, right? Because we are every one of us is baptized into Christ's mission as priest, prophet, and king. So today, let's dive in to what it means to be king. Now, before we start, the first thing I want to hit, before I even jump in and we do the little Zoom thing and all into our session, which is like right there, right somewhere. Before we dive into that, what I want to make sure we have a clear understanding of, right, is that the laity as king, we need to watch how we think of the word king, right? Because so often in our world, we think of king as somebody who rules, as somebody who's kind of like the empower person who's holding down and pushing down the lower classes, right? He's the top, the bourgeoisie or whatever. Like it's this big kind of like idea of power associated with king. We gotta begin first by having a true understanding of what it means to be king. King is not necessarily a grasp for power. What the king is, right, the role as king is servant. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more. But a lot of people, when we think of king, we think of hierarchies, right? We think of, oh yeah, you're at the top of the hierarchy, so you have the power and you can reign over people, tell them what to do, have all the riches and stuff at your disposal. No. That's not king that we're working on today, right? That's not the king that we're diving in today as part of our teaching. The king that we're going to be touching on is going to be a servant. First and foremost, a servant. First and foremost, one who wears the crown but is uplifting the rest. So one of the ways Scott Hahn has introduced this concept, and he talks about he uses this in reference to the church, but I think it's fitting, is that so often when we look at a hierarchy, we think of a triangle, right? You got all your people that are subservient at the bottom, and then you go up a level, and then there you push down on those people, and then a couple of more people go up, and then a couple of more people go up, and a couple of more people go up, and then at the top you got one guy, right? So often it's like the church, like it's like the laity, and then like some people that like volunteer and work at the church, and then like, oh, here's your clergy, right? Deacons, priests, all those guys. Oh, and then you go, oh, here's the bishop, or here's the pastors, right? Oh, and here's the bishops, and here's the cardinals, and here, oh, boy, at the top is the pope, right? and he rained down upon everybody else. Before we dive in, we got to start with, it's not a triangle like this, right? The triangle is upside down, where as the wider group, the next group, you actually descend and support. And then you descend and support, and you descend and support. So we, right, if we think of it that way, the king is the one at the very bottom. The king is the one at the very bottom that supports the whole of everybody else, right? Supports the rest of the world, lifting people up. So that's how we have to understand, and we have to kind of look at who the king is in this situation, right? Is that it's the bottom actually lifts up and supports everybody else. It's a hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy of service where you are lower and lower and lower and lifting people up. As a joke, this is why just to ingest, like, this is why I never want to be a bishop. Right? Because you're given all of the lay faithful, all of the clergy, all of your volunteers, all of these people, right? And you're called as a bishop to support everyone. You're called to support everyone that works in and lives in the diocese. Not just the Catholics, not just the Protestants, not just people of faith, but everyone, right? If we think about it that way, it's amazing how we can go down. But it's called to be a level of support, always lifting up. The Pope, there's a stories of the Pope whenever he gets elected, that once a Pope is elected in the Sistine Chapel, there's a room off to the side. It's this little sacristy area, and that's where he gets dressed, and he changes from his red of being a cardinal into the white cassock of being a Pope, and everybody's like, oh yeah, it's so great and so beautiful. The nickname for that room is called the Room of Tears, because when they walk into that room and they start to put on the cassock, most of the time the men break down crying, because they know, oh my goodness, oh my Lord, I am now in support of the entirety of humankind. I'm called to be a vicar for Christ, like the vicar of Christ. I'm called to support everyone in the world, right? That's the role that a king should be playing, not somebody who's proud and a warmonger or just worried about his riches or something like a king. The idea of king, the identity of king that we're baptized into, that was Jesus's identity of king, is one of service, right? Is one of lifting others up. So in that way, let's continue as we hear the word king, fight the temptation as much as we possibly can of thinking of a king as someone who reigns over. Rather, we support from below, all right? I think that's the best way I could say it. Don't reign over, we support from below. And it's kind of cool. I got this little light right here, like it's right there. So, but just whatever we do, no reigning over, supporting from below, king of service, right? So let's dive in to our session 4, Laity as King. It's cool. We got like another picture of Jesus in the middle, and we got some like little slides around. It's going to be really nice. It's going to be a great, great session. All right. I'm very excited about this. So as we've done before, let's look at, if we're going to look at king, right? If we're going to begin by looking at king, we have to first, I think, get a foundation for us, right? As we have in every time to this point, let's look at Old Testament examples of king, right? So the first, the primary, the biggest, the most popular image of king that we find in the Old Testament is King David. King David, we can say his life is broken down into basically two different places, right? He has a younger life that we hear about, and then we have a later life that we hear about in the Old Testament. In his young life, right? A lot of us might be familiar with it, but if you're not, King David was the youngest son of Jesse. Jesse had 12 sons, and the prophet Samuel is sent to Jesse to anoint one of his sons as the king of Israel, as the king of the Jewish people in the of the Hebrew people in the Old Testament, right? Be it Hebrew, Jewish, it's a technical term, whatever. Of those people in the Old Testament, right? And whenever he's sent to him, what he does is he comes to Jesse and he says, "I'm here to anoint your son," essentially. And Jesse says, "Okay, great." So he brings out his oldest son, And no, that's not him. That's not the one that the Lord is chosen. That's not the one that the presence of the Lord rests upon. Okay. So he brings out his next son. And no, that's not him. And he brings out 11 of his sons. And Jesse looks at it, and Samuel looks at him and says, no, it's none of these. Are you sure this is all your boys? And Jesse looks at him and says, well, there is the youngest, but he's out in the field tending the sheep. It's not him. And when he walked up, what happens? Samuel looks at him and says, that's the one. That's the one. That's the one that God is calling. That's the person that God is calling to be the leader of his chosen people. So he anoints him. He anoints David king of Israel. Now the thing is that there's a king in place, right? His name's Saul, not to be confused with Saul, who later on was in the Acts of the Apostles and became Paul and wrote half the New Testament. No. This is King Saul of the Old Testament. And he's leading the country at the time, right? And David becomes very, very, very. His reputation starts to precede him. He's been anointed, but not like crowned yet, right? But his reputation starts to precede him. He has that whole thing where he takes out a giant with a sling, right? And King Saul starts to really like him at one point and like lift him up, and then all of a sudden it's like, no. The people want this guy to be king, so I'm gonna try and fight him. I'm gonna try and kill him. I'm gonna try and like put him aside. And it happens throughout the course of the scripture that sooner or later David ends up on the run from Saul because Saul's trying to kill him. There's some really beautiful stories that happen in there. But that's his young life, right? But David ends up during his young life growing in popularity, becoming this star of sorts in the Jewish amongst the Jewish people, right? And then after, we have the second half of his life, his later in life. He's anointed king, and he transfers the capital of Judah to Jerusalem, right? He's the one that brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant is the presence of God on earth. So if you think about it, it would be similar to not having a church. Imagine a church that had been shut down for a long time, and then all of a sudden we're going to reopen a parish and we're going to bring the Eucharist back in, right? The joy around that, it was that even greater because you didn't have the Eucharist available at other places. You didn't have the Ark available anywhere else. This was the totality and presence of God on earth, and he's the one that brings the Ark of Covenant to Jerusalem. In fact, so much so he dances before it. He as the Ark is being brought, I imagine like it's a parade kind of thing, and like he's second line and got his handkerchief and all. But that's just the New Orleans that's still stuck in me. So we hear about all these good things that David does, but one of the things he also does is he's not perfect. He has a sin with Bethsaida, right? Bathsheba. I'm sorry. I think that's a wrong word. The wife of Uriah. He has Uriah, right? The husband of this one. So David kind of gets fat and happy. He starts to live it up, and he's kind of happy with where he's at, and he forgets about this idea of serving the people of God and of following the commands that God has and leading the church, leading his people in this way. That he gets kind of fat and happy, and in the middle of the day, what does he do? He goes up on his rooftop and he sees her bathing. And when he sees her bathing, he falls in love, like he has this lustful kind of attraction towards her. And what does he do? He takes her in, and she conceives. And as a way of kind of trying to cover up his problem, trying to cover up what he did, what he does is he puts Uriah on the front lines of a battle. He puts him in the very front lines of a battle so that he will die, knowing that he's going to die, and basically has Uriah murdered so that he can take in his wife and raise the son. Now, obviously, this isn't kosher. This isn't what we should be doing, right? This is a major issue, like a major sin. And what do we see? David, he falls. He's not perfect, right? But the thing about David that's different, one of the things about David that's different is that David repents for what he's done, right? He repents and he runs to God with his sin. He runs to God. So he's reminded by Jonathan, the son of Saul, about all this stuff and like kind of brought to his senses. And what does he do? He doesn't fight with Jonathan. He doesn't say, no, that's not the case. Or Nathan, I forget. He doesn't fight with him. He doesn't go against them. He doesn't say, no, I'm doing this. Everything's fine. No, what he does is he says, I'm a sinner. I've fallen away. And he repents. And that's what I think the key in this is that even though the rest of his life is littered with betrayals, rebellions, and things like that, David's personal sin never turns him away from God, right? And I think that's why he's seen as the model king, even to today in the Jewish religion, that David is seen as the model. Actually, when I went to Israel with when we went to the Holy Land with our deacon class a couple years back, we were able to go to David's burial place. It's still venerated. His gravesite is still venerated, and a bunch of the Jewish people were in there praying their prayers and everything. Like, it was a really beautiful moment to be able to see where King David is buried, right? The other thing I think is interesting is that idolatry was more serious. It was in a lot of ways more serious than adultery. Let me say that again. Idolatry, right? Looking at some finding some kind of an idol, right? Making something else equal to God was more of a serious thing in his life than was the sin of adultery that he committed, right? But either way, his personal sin never turns him completely away from God, right? God is always ready to redeem him. He's always ready to give his mercy, even to King David, right? As long as he sought it. So for us, that's a hopeful message, right? That the quintessential king of the Old Testament, the king par excellence of the Old Testament, was flawed. He was not perfect, but that he was able to receive God's mercy anytime he asked for it, right? Now, he did the penance. He spent time in sackcloth and ashes and all these things. Like they did their penance, and the nation suffered on his behalf, but it never turned him completely away from God. Now, remember, the Old Testament king, right? Just as the Old Testament prophets and the Old Testament priest, all of those point to the fulfillment of that role, right? King David, who's one of his descendants that we hear about? Well, if we read the Gospel of Matthew and we just walk through, we're going to hear a lot of funny names, right? Every deacon hates it on Christmas, for Christmas Mass. We got a whole genealogy full of names. But when you get to the end of it, from David comes Jesus. So from the house of David comes the fulfillment of the king. And that's what we got next. Christ the King, right? So we hear about Jesus, right? And we hear the moment, right, in this teaching, or in Jesus's life, that we see and hear about Jesus's kingly mission, kingly role. Especially, it comes to light at his crucifixion, right? It comes to light at his crucifixion. Now, he is a servant throughout, right? He is healing the poorest of the poor. He's spending time with those who are worst off. I think one of the big moments that we see him as a servant and not as a reigning king, right, is whenever Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. We read about it every Holy Thursday, and it's reenacted for us at Holy Thursday Mass, where 12 people come up and the priest wash the feet to show, I'm going to take the role of the servant. I'm going to take the role of the lowest of the low, right, and serve the other people here, right? But even though Jesus experiences these things, the first time he is asked, one of the first times he's asked is actually like about this role of him as king, which he's been saying. One of the first times we hear that is when in his conversation with Pilate. So let's read John 18, 33 to 38. It should be on your sheet. I don't have the sheet in front of me, so we're just going to go with it. So we read, "So Pilate summoned Jesus and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Jesus answered, 'Do you say this on your own, or have others told you about me?' Pilate answered, 'I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest handed you over to me. What have you done?' Jesus answered, 'My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom did belong to this world, my attendants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not here.' So Pilate said to him, 'Then you are a king.' Jesus answered, 'You say I am a king. For this I was born, for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone belongs to the truth, listens to my voice.' Pilate said to him, 'What is truth?' When he had said this, he again went out to the Jews and said to them, 'I find no guilt in him.'" It's very interesting, a very, very interesting exchange between Jesus and Pilate that happens here, right? Where Jesus kind of backhandedly or kind of is forced into a corner of admitting he's a king, first off. And he says, "My kingdom does not belong to this world." Like, I am not a worldly king. I don't claim to be a worldly king. I don't want to be a worldly king, right? But he says, my kingdom is the next world. My kingdom is beyond this world. And my attendants, you know what? My kingdom can't be strong in this world because the army would be coming after you. But they're not, because I don't have that. My kingdom's not here. And then Pilate said, "So you are a king?" And he said, "You say I'm a king." And then he says, "For this I was born, for this I came to testify to the truth." Now, Jesus, during the course of his life, in different moments, one of his most famous lines is when he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. Whoever comes to me comes to my Father," right? Like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So if you're in relationship with me, you understand the truth. You understand what's the next, what's beyond just today, right? You understand that there's something bigger at work. And I think if we dive into that, we see a man who he's talking to who has no relationship with him. So what happens? He's confused by a concept of truth. He's confused by a concept of truth. He is confused by this idea that there's something beyond. Because quite honestly, Pilate's a Roman. The Romans basically sacrificed to the gods whoever they wanted, whatever household gods they had, right? As the Romans went out and spread their empire, what would happen is they would basically appropriate the gods of the places that people would have and just say, okay, you can worship your own gods, but you have to worship Roman gods as well. You have to worship the gods of Rome as well. And if you don't, then we're going to attack you. But that's how they spread their kingdom. And the thing is Christians, Jews, would not allow themselves to fall into idolatry. So there's the rub of the Roman occupation of Jewish land. And now we got a guy, that's the Jewish rub, and now we got a guy who's saying that he's the fulfillment of the Jews. So the Jews don't like him because they're saying you're putting yourself equal with God. You're calling yourself Yahweh. And the Romans don't like him because they're saying, oh, you're trying to say you're a God? No. Pilate has zero relationship with Jesus. He has zero relationship with the true God. So he's even confused on what is truth. I think this is something that our world today, we hear a lot about, this concept of truth. You may have heard it before. There's people that will say, oh, you live your truth. Live your truth. That's becoming more and more popular today, especially around certain agendas in the world, that you live your truth. You live your best life. You live your truth. What's happening is that I think over and over in our world today, there's a culture war kind of at work where people are trying to say, hey, you know what? There's not an objective standard by which we should live. There's not an objective good and evil. There's not an objective true. That everything is subjective. Now, let me say it again. Objective, how it actually exists, right? Subjective, how I perceive it exist. Everything in our world today, a lot of things are falling into being a subjective truth. Well, you say it's that, I say it's this, right? You say it's blue, I say it's green. You say it's right, I say it's wrong. You say it's right. You say even to fundamental truths of scientific facts, right? You say I'm a boy. I say I'm a girl. This is just how our world kind of works, that we don't have an objective sense of truth, right? And I'm not going to blame it. There's a lot of things that happen. But one of the things, and I think Pilate kind of elicits this and shows this, is that when we're out of relationship with God, when we lose God as a benchmark, right? You say God exists, I don't believe it, right? So here's these are just a few. This is just one exchange where Jesus really shows himself as Christ. If you look closely to the slide, you'll see there's an image from Caesarea. He's one of my favorite. This is one of my favorite images that you'll see in the Old Testament. I mean, in art. It's called "Behold the Man." Ecce Homo. It's a beautiful, beautiful painting. One that I've been wanting to get, actually, but it's a beautiful, beautiful painting. But off to the side, you'll see these three little phrases: Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus imperat. That comes from a chant that we use in the church sometimes. And the translation is: Christ conquers, Christ reigns, Christ commands. It's a beautiful chant. It's something that we'll hear a lot, but that Christ conquers, but Christ doesn't conquer with an iron fist and with a scepter, right? Christ conquers with a gift of self and death on the cross, right? Christ reigns. Christ doesn't reign on earth. Christ reigns in heaven. And Christ commands. Christ doesn't command with an iron fist and threatening hell, right? Christ commands with love and out of concern for others. Jesus flips what we commonly understand and what we commonly see as Jesus flips what we commonly accept as a kingly role on its head, right? He should have been born in a palace as the king. Instead, he was born in a manger, in a barn, surrounded by animal poop. You know, like just to be very honest, like Jesus, he should have had the most decadent lifestyle. Instead, he was a homeless man walking around, right? Like with 12 of his friends. Right? He should have been honored and revered. Instead, he was killed. Jesus flips on his head what those terms mean: conquers, reigns, commands. Right? He flips on its head what we would normally expect. Right? He flips our expectation. Right? And in the same way, we're called to live out a kingly role that might not be an earthly king. Right? It might not be a middle-aged looking tale of knights and a crown and a castle, right? Lex orandi, lex credendi. It's three Latin word, a Latin phrase, 4 words that we see right there. Lex orandi means the way of prayer, and lex credendi means the way of belief. So lex orandi, oremus, is let us pray. Right? So lex orandi and lex credendi. If you look closely to credendi, you can kind of see the word creed. We say that we believe. This is what we're getting from, right? Credo is we believe. That's when we pray the creed at Mass. That's where the word creed comes from. We believe. So we pray and we believe what we pray. Right? So the prayer of the church a lot of times will give us and elicit to us what it is that we actually believe in the church. Right? So we can see it here. Dearly beloved, and this is from the rite of baptism, right? Dearly beloved, this child has been reborn in baptism. This is at the very end of the baptism. We just poured the water on the kid's head, right? Gave them their little bath, put some chrism on their head, gave them the candle, gave them the white garment. We did everything. We're about to pray the Our Father. That's where we're at, right? So it's the end of getting to the end of the rite of baptism. Dearly beloved, this child has been reborn in baptism. He is now called a child of God, for so indeed he is. In confirmation, he will receive the fullness of God's Spirit. In Holy Communion, he will share the banquet of Christ's sacrifice, calling God his Father in the midst of the church. So think about this. If Jesus is a king, if God is the king, if he reigns over all, if he has the kingdom of God is his, we're being adopted into that family, right? We are being adopted as sons and daughters of a king that makes us princes and princesses, that makes us heirs to an inheritance, that makes us, right, members of this family that's beyond just, it's beyond just the level of semantics or names or what we're going to do with our Sunday mornings, but rather this is something that we're being adopted into a family, right? If anybody, if you know of anybody that has been adopted, into in civilly, right, into a family, there's a joy around an adoption, because now they're brought into the structure and the family and everything about it, right? They're able to embrace all of the things that these people are about, right? That this child is no longer alone, but that they have somebody, they have a foundation. In that way, right, we have an inheritance. So what is our inheritance, right? What is the inheritance that we are given, right? If there's a king, there must be a kingdom. So what is the inheritance that we have been promised? Now, the kingdom of heaven, right, it's not of this world. But John, St. John, the evangelist, the last book of the Bible is a vision that he had of heaven. Now, when we talk about the last book of the Bible, it's Revelation. Real quick, not Revelations, no S, right? It's the revelation, the apocalypse, right? Just means reveal, right? The apocalypse to John, right? It shows, it's a revealing of what's to come. What's the kingdom of heaven look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like, smell like? Like, what is it? And it's being revealed to John. Now, this is a long quote, but the reason why I say this is because there's an inheritance that's greater than we can possibly imagine. And he does his best in the 21st chapter of Revelations, he does his best to use language and imagery from the world to try and describe what he's seeing, right? So here we go. He took me in spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city of Jerusalem coming down from heaven from God. Now, the holy city of Jerusalem, this would be it displays to the Jewish mindset, right? That this is the holy city. This is the kingdom of God in heaven, right? The holy city of God in heaven. This is our inheritance. Remember that, our inheritance. It gleamed with the splendor of God. Its radiance was like that of precious stone, like jasper, clear as crystal. It had a massive high wall with 12 gates, where 12 angels were stationed, and on which were inscribed the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, of the Israelites. There were 3 gates facing east, 3 north, 3 south, 3 west. The wall of the city had 12 courses of stones as its foundation, on which were inscribed the 12 names of the apostles of the Lamb. So this is built, right? This entire kingdom, this entire image is built on the foundation of the 12 tribes of Israel. Or it's the 12 tribes of Israel have been kind of the gateway in for the Old Testament people. And the foundation of this city is the 12 apostles. I'm sorry, I've lost my spot. The wall of the city had 12 courses of stones, its foundations of 12 apostles, of the Lamb. The one who spoke to me held a gold measuring rod to measure the city, its gates, and its walls. The city was square, its length the same as its width. The measure of the city with the rod, he measured the city with the rod and found 1,500 miles in length and width and height. 1,500 miles in length, width, and height. That's almost half our country. That's almost half of the United States that you're talking about. 1,500 miles, length, width, and height. Denver is the mile-high city, times 1,500. Think about that. The size, the utter magnitude, the size of this that John is able to express back to the people, right back in his writings. He also measured its wall, 144 cubits according to the standard unit of measure the angel used. The wall was constructed of jasper, while the city was pure gold, clear as glass. The city was pure gold, clear as glass. The foundations of the city wall were decorated with every precious stone. The first course of stones was jasper, the second sapphire, third, fourth emeralds, onyx. Oh my goodness! All of these different beautiful stones, topaz, hyacinth, amethyst, all these beautiful stones, all these precious stones. They ornated the city. I think of this for the March for Life. We were able to go to the Natural History Museum, and in it they have like the Hope Diamond and a couple of other really, really beautiful gems. And you just think like, okay, they're precious, and they're under like all kind of security in the world right now, right? These are what the city is constructed of. These are the bricks of the city. The 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each of the gates made from a single pearl. How big of an oyster do you have to be able to have a gate that's made of a pearl, right? The city streets were pure gold, transparent as glass. I saw no temple in the city, for the temple is the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb. The city had no need of sun or moon shining on it, for the glory of God gave it light, and its lamp was the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their treasure. This is beautiful. Like this is the inheritance that we're promised, right? I use this mainly just to kind of give us a way to dive into Revelation, that this shows us what it is like in heaven, right? This is the Apostle John giving us kind of a glimpse into what our inheritance is. This is meant to be for you and I. This whole kingdom is meant to be a place for you and I. This is it's so much greater than anything on earth. Doesn't matter how big of a mansion you live in, what type of car you live in, what kind of things you have. This is the promise of every single Christian. Whether we're rich or poor, man or woman, it doesn't matter. Now, for us to live this, for us to receive that inheritance, right, we have to do something. It's not just going to be handed to us. It's not just going to be, oh, yeah, it's a matter of will and you're there. No. We have to live in relationship with God. We have to remain in relationship with God. We have to continue in living out this idea of servant king, right? So Lumen Gentium from Second Vatican Council says, the faithful therefore must learn the deepest meaning and value of all of creation, as well as its role in a harmonious praise of God. They must assist each other to live holier lives even in their daily occupations. In this way, the world may be permanently permeated by the Spirit of Christ, and it may more effectively fulfill its purpose in justice, charity, and peace. We are called, right? We are, as human beings, we are social people, right? Right now, you're probably learning that more than, even if you're the biggest introvert in the world. After 2 months of living at home alone, or living at home with the same people, at a certain point, it's like, please, God, I just want to get out, right? We're meant to be social people. We're meant to have social interaction, right? God created us as a communion of persons, right? God himself is a communion of persons. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity, right, reveals to us who we are as human beings. And in that way, we're social beings, right? We're supposed to be interacting with one another. Now, there's one of the things that we have to realize is that for us to live as the social beings means we act in a society, right? And there are principles by which we're supposed to act and supposed to live, right? Now, this is the part of King that I think is so important, that's super important, and that if we miss probably the teaching of all of this, right? Catholic social teaching, right, is the best kept secret in Catholicism. That's what the first professor I had was Father Matthew Clark. He's a monk at the Abbey, and he made a comment the first class we had with him. He said Catholic social teaching is the best kept secret in Catholicism. And I remember him saying that and being like, yeah, whatever. It's not this isn't going to be a big deal. And we started reading it, and I'm like, wow, it is. Oh my goodness, it is such a kept secret because this is how the gospel, right? These are the principles by which the gospel is supposed to impact our life, right? Now, you'll hear a lot of different things, the themes of Catholic social teaching. If you have an old document, there's probably 7 of them listed, right? This is the place where there's a little bit of a difference. So if you have an old one, if you have an old list of notes and there's 7 points, preferential adoption for the poor, things like that. That's one way to kind of look at Catholic social teaching and break it down. But one of my in doing this course, when I wrote this course, I didn't have one of my teachers from Notre Dame yet, and I think she hits on it pretty well. Her name was Dr. Jennifer Miller. Fantastic teacher, great class, really loved it. And she basically kind of broke it down in the following way, that there's a balance of sameness and uniqueness that has to govern the way that we approach working in the world, right? The way that we approach living in a society, that there's a balance between sameness and uniqueness. Now, what do I mean? We're all same. We're all human beings, right? We all live in the world, those kind of things. But we're also, no one else is called the JD, right? No one else is the youngest in my family. No one else is the administrator of St. Hilary, right? So there's a sameness that I share with everyone, right? And then there's a uniqueness that I have that's me, right? I'm going to break down these 4 terms, right? But remember, the purpose of this is that, like, solidarity and subsidiarity, these 2 words are meant to be seen as 2 principles that balance each other out, right? That there's a balance of sameness and uniqueness. So, for example, solidarity. We are all human beings, right? In our culture, we're all human beings. Whether you're a Catholic, Muslim, Jewish, atheist, you're a human being, right? At the same time, we are all we can kind of narrow it down a little bit. We're all members of citizens and residents of the United States of America, right? If you narrow it down even more, we are citizens and representatives of the state of Louisiana, right? We're all but there's a commonality between us, right, where we are the same. And we have to remember that we are the same, right? Doesn't matter your race, we're still a human being. Doesn't matter what your religion is, we're still a human being, right? At the same time, there's a sense of subsidiarity. Now, subsidiarity basically states, and you may, if you don't know this, this might be a kind of rudimentary explanation of it, but subsidiarity basically states that any government or any aid should happen from its lowest possible level. So what do I mean? For our community, our tax code should be run by our local government as best as it possibly can. And if it can't, then it needs to move up to maybe a state government. And if it can't there, then it maybe needs to move up to a national government, right? That subsidiarity empowers the most local first and then works its way up. Now, there are things, though, that we can't be just a bunch of little isolated islands, right, in subsidiarity. Excuse me. We can't just be a bunch of little isolated islands because if we go too far with the uniqueness, then what I say goes and what you say goes, and how do we do that? How do we that causes conflict? But we have to recognize we're the same and we're different, right? So, for example, we don't need I'm just going to pull something out of the blue. We misspeak about policy or something like that. I don't mean this to be like a political statement or anything. We don't necessarily need somebody from Minnesota, right, to tell us how to handle our seafood, right, or how to handle wildlife and fisheries, right? No one in Minnesota knows how we handle tags for alligators and duck hunting, right? Just as an example. They may know some stuff, and they have an experience in Minnesota, and their way of handling things in Minnesota might be different than the way we handle things in Louisiana. But we don't need a game warden that works from Minnesota and tries to tell Louisiana how to handle their wildlife, right? Because it's too different. There should be subsidiarity. Like, we should be working here locally on that kind of thing, right? Or somewhat locally, state level, that kind of thing. But at the same time, solidarity tells us that we shouldn't hunt everything no matter what. Even if we have a high population, we shouldn't just shoot every greenhead duck that there is, because guess what? Then there's no greenhead ducks. Like there should be a balance of we're the same, but we're also unique, right? In the same way. So those two, right? They balance each other out, and they play on each other. And these are principles, right, that should be upheld in our social structures, right? These are principles that can influence things like business, things like politics, right? Things like policy that we have in these different realms. In the same time, there's a balance between the common good and human dignity, right? We want to lift up the common good, where we want everyone, the entire society, to grow together, to become stronger, to become more prosperous, right? To be able to, the common good doesn't just include cash. Like just the amount of money somebody makes, or the security that somebody has, or the power that somebody has. The common good also is just like the moral good of everybody, right? We should be doing everything we can to promote within our society, in our world, the common good, right? The best possible outcome, the best moral good for everyone involved, right? That's how we're called to live as Catholics, to promote the common good. But at the same time, we need to uphold human dignity, right? And that human dignity is, one, I am a child of God. Every single person that is created is a child of God, whether they're baptized or not, or atheist or unbelieving or whatever, that every single person has dignity that should be honored, right? But at the same time, it's not so individualized that you become the ruler of the world and you become the ruler of the world, right? That everything should circulate around you. But there's a balance that some things in the common good, right, balance that out, right? So life is a good thing, absolutely, and that's an absolute truth, right? Life, and we need to be we want people to be as prosperous as they possibly can be. We want them to be able to live with a certain level of dignity. At the same time, the balance comes in, right? Because the human dignity comes also with a certain responsibility, right? An agency to be able to make their own. The common good also says we're going to make sure to provide for a certain amount of care and help and support so that everyone can lift up. Right? This is the way, like this is the balance that we find. And I think this is one of the things that these are a couple of the places where this balance of sameness and uniqueness is really where for lack of a better phrase, like this is where our politics kind of goes to hell, because there's no sense of balance between, right? Both parties in our United States seem to be pulling at one of these threads, and they're pulling so hard that they almost unravel the whole thing, right? And it just seems like to me, the place that I kind of see it, and you see the struggle of the balance that right now, and this is why I changed this part a little bit from in the notes, because I think it's so prevalent to what's the discussions right now. With yesterday, our governor John Bell Edwards saying that the state's going to extend its closure for another 15 days. And there's a lot of Facebook discussion, and I don't want to get into that. I'm not going to get into that. But this is where the struggle, right, of the balance comes in. Because there's a desire to want to open the state and be able to open up business and open up industry and everything and be able to promote the common good, right? That we can become prosperous, that business won't shut down, that more people won't be hurt, right? You want to do that, but at the same time, there's a struggle for human dignity. Like, well, we open the state, but that puts people in danger, right? But we have to open the state, but we also want to protect life, and there's a both and here, right? That it's not so easy, it's not so clear cut that it's one or the other. It's probably a level of both, right, and a balance of both. Now, I'm not just be very, very clear. I'm not trying to side with or against the governor, because I'm trying to just lay the principles out that's supposed to govern these decisions, right? That's not my payroll. My payroll is to be a priest and to talk about Jesus and do the stuff that Jesus does, right? Not to make policy. But this is where the Catholic social teaching, right, can influence real-time decisions. What's the balance between the common good and human dignity in this case, right? So I just wanted to lay that out, right? That these are those kind of decisions. Now, if it's intrinsically evil things, abortion, never, no, period. It's a sin completely against dignity, completely against the common good across the board, right? Those kind of things, no. But there are some discussions of things that are less serious, quote unquote, less serious, or that aren't intrinsically evil. It's a technical phrase in the church. That these are the four principles, especially, that tend to guide the Catholic response to things. There's also preferential option for the poor, that Jesus associated with the poor so closely that we do our best in all phases of life to always be reaching out to the poor, right? Reaching out to supporting and helping those who are less fortunate, who have fallen on hard times, right? Who find themselves in hard spaces. And that's where the arm of like Catholic Charities or Catholic Relief Services, those kind of places come into effect, right? But I just wanted to name especially these, that we as kings, right, we as baptized into Christ's kingship, into Christ's service, we're called to live out in the world in a balanced way of upholding solidarity, subsidiarity, and the common good and human dignity. If you have any questions about that, you can type them in. And like I said, I'm not going to make any political statements, but particularly clarity around this language. I know this is a really quick dive and a really quick explanation on these four terms, but like this can be a class in and of itself. Like we literally did a full class on subsidiarity, a full class on solidarity when I was in seminary. But I just wanted to introduce this concept of the balance of uniqueness and sameness, right? That we are unique, but we are the same as well. Great. So this is how we're called to live it out. So if we look, we can go back to Lumen Gentium. That's the Second Vatican Council, right? Now Christ has communicated his royal power to his disciples, that they might be constituted in royal freedom, and that by true presence and holy life they might conquer the reign of sin in themselves. Further, he has shared his power so that serving Christ and their fellow men, they might by humility and patience lead their brethren to that King for whom to serve is to reign. Okay. There's a twofold, what this is basically saying, there's a twofold mastery that has to happen. This phrase comes from Dr. Tom Neal. I have him quoted multiple times on the website. So if you just click the link, that's probably like this way, I think, yeah, that way, or above me, or something like that. If you click the link, you go to our page on the St. Hilary website, where I have all the videos and everything else. If you go there and you scroll to the bottom, you'll see a bunch of different things, of a blog, a couple other things from Dr. Neal. Fantastic man. Love that man. Holy man. Please, if you get a chance, listen to the 2 podcasts that I have there. So good. But what we're saying here is that to live out this, right, you have to have a twofold mastery. We have to have an authority over ourselves, and then we can exercise the authority over the world around us, right? That if we're going to have authority in living out as king, and living out as the servant king, we have to let God first reign in us before we can reign in the world. Does that make sense? Right? We have to first be of God before we can proclaim on behalf of God. Right? That authority is not something that we first just wield and bang people over the head with and yell the Bible quotes at people. Right? No, authority is first meant from being recognizing that we're adopted into the kingdom, and then going out to spread said kingdom. Right. There was a experience I had before I entered seminary. This is back whenever I was in college, and like the theology of the body had gotten really, really popular, very, very quickly. And I love the theology of the body, and I could talk about that all day. But the theology of the body had gotten extremely popular at one point. And there was a group of men at this parish, or in this area that I knew, or that a buddy of mine knew, and I went with him. We went to talk to these group of guys, and while we were there, I remember this group just being so fired up about the study and the teaching, and like it was something that was very, very revelatory for these like 4 or 5 men. They were so on board and just wanted to do something. They wanted to do something to just be able to share and to express what is just to basically like spread the message of the theology of the body as soon as they possibly could. And they were fired up, and it was beautiful, and it was great. And I remember my buddy and I sitting down, like hearing their story, and just wow, they were all like, they were introduced to it within like a month, like of that meeting, and like they were just like, man, we want to go and like just start sharing this. So this is our plan. Like next week we're going to 3 parishes, and the week after that we're going to 4 more parishes, and the week after that we're going to another one. And you know what? All these parishes are going to hear it, and they're all going to just turn on, and it's all going to be amazing, and it's just going to spread like wildfire. In like 2 weeks we're going to cover the whole diocese. And I remember my buddy like looking back and being like, wow, that's very exciting, but y'all need to pump y'all brakes. And I was like buying in. I'm like, let's go. Like, yeah, this is going to be awesome. And I remember my buddy looking at him and saying, before you go and spread it, do you have a mastery of it? And are you living it? And the guys kind of looked and they said, does it dictate everything about your life? Have you conformed your life in every possible way to live by the message of this teaching? And I remember the guys kind of looked at him and they were kind of taken aback by it. They were like, man, what you mean? Like, we on board. Let's go. I'm excited about sharing this and doing all these things. And I just remember my buddy going, before you ever can go out and do that, you have to speak from a place of authority. Again, Pope Paul VI's quote, right? Like you have to let it exercise authority over you, right? The teaching, the Lord, just in general, like it's an early conversion. That's great. And you're excited, but like, there's got to be a relationship that develops and then sends you out. And I think it's very true. Like the twofold mastery is we exercise authority over ourselves, right? How am I living the faith? How am I sharing the gospel? How am I integrating those principles of Catholic social teaching into my personal life before I go out and try and tell somebody how they have to live? Right? Like how beautiful, how amazing would it be if we would first share what is going on, or first allow right, these different principles to first take root in our life before we start beating people over the head with a Facebook post. And I say that with all reverence and love, but I think it's kind of true. Like there's a lot of hate that gets spit, and a lot of times it's because we need to first allow the message of the gospel, right, to take control of our life before we criticize Trump or Pelosi, right? And I say that again without making a statement, because it's a both and, right? So there's that's just I think that's a space for us to kind of pay attention to, right? Is how am I mastering my own life before I can master the world around me, right? I have to exercise authority over myself before I exercise authority over the rest of the world around me. All right. We're going to look at John Paul II, his words on this, on that idea, and then we're going to look at St. Louis, King of France. St. Louis, King of France. If you look at the handout, I have a much longer version of this letter that he writes, but it's a letter written to his son. So let's begin with John Paul II. Because the lay faithful belong to Christ, Lord and King of the universe, they share in his kingly mission and are called by him to spread the kingdom in history. They exercise their kingship as Christians, above all, in the spiritual combat in which they seek to overcome in themselves the kingdom of sin. So think about that. The first place, the first battleground for this king is our souls against the kingdom of sin. Our souls against the kingdom of sin is the initial and primary battleground for the kingdom of God to take root. And then to make a gift of themselves so as to serve in justice and in charity. Jesus, who is himself present in all his brothers and sisters, above all in the very least. So this is the kingship that we are called, that all Christians, right, especially us Catholics, that we are called to live in, is that we are called to be, to first, right, practice authority over ourselves, right, to turn away from sin, to fight that battle. Excuse me. Before turning our attention to going out and serving, right? St. Louis, King of France, he reiterates this. He says, "My dearest son," right? King of France to his son, "My dearest son, my first instruction is that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your strength. Without this, there is no salvation. Keep yourself, my son, from everything that you know displeases God. That is to say, from every mortal sin. You should permit yourself to be tormented by every kind of martyrdom before you yourself commit a mortal sin." We're called to practice authority over ourselves. We're called to battle, right, against the kingdom of sin that's within each one of us. That's within our fallen flesh. That's within us as human beings who are now on this side of the fall have this sense of concupiscence that attracts us towards sin, right? And Louis, King of France, this is a word of a dad to his son. Let anything else befall you, like any kind of martyrdom, suffer anything before committing a mortal sin, before breaking that relationship with God, right? I think that's a key for us. That's a major key for us, that we're called, right, to be in relationship with God to the point that we don't want to turn away from other sins, right? That we're called to exercise this mastery over ourselves before we ever go out and serve, before we ever step into that role at the bottom of the triangle, right? The bottom of the hierarchy, right? Lifting others up. How do we do this? Well, it might be a cliche. It might sound like a cliche answer in the Catholic world, but it's by love, right? There was a priest, Father Pedro Arrupe. He was the superior general for the Jesuits worldwide, right? And he was given a talk one time, and in this talk, he said he gave this beautiful talk on falling in love with God and all these different things, and it was very, very beautiful, and people were very engaged with it. And there was a question and answer session at the end of it. And in this question and answer session, there was a reporter that stood up, and the reporter asked him, said, "Father Rupe, thank you so much for the talk. It was beautiful. It's so nice to hear your words and your encouragements." And then he looked at him and he said, "But can we find something practical? Like, can you give me something like practical about this? Like about falling in love with God? Like, what practically? Can you just give me something very practical?" And Father Rupe kind of froze for a second, and then he responded. He said, and there's a small quote here, but I'm going to read the whole quote. "Nothing is more practical than finding God, than falling in love in a quite absolute and final way. What you are in love with, what seizes your imagination, will affect everything. It will decide what gets you out of bed in the morning, what you do with your evenings, how you spend your weekends, what you read, whom you know, what breaks your heart, and what amazes you with joy and gratitude. Fall in love, stay in love, and it will decide everything." Father Rupe. Fall in love, stay in love, and it will decide everything. Fall in love with the Lord and remain in love with the Lord. And that's going to decide how we govern ourselves and how we go out and live as kings and heirs in the world. Fall in love, stay in love, and it'll decide everything. I encourage you to take that to prayer, right? Take the words of Louis, King of France, into your prayer, because that's going to be a key in living out and understanding how it is that we're called to be kings, because we can't ever be kings if we don't first recognize ourselves as princes and princesses of a loving Father. So that's really our threefold mission, right? Our threefold mission as priest, prophet, and king. I'm gonna steal another phrase from Dr. Neal, and I think these words now going to mean a lot more. If I would have said them, a month ago, they may not have registered. But after diving into understanding who Jesus is as priest, or who we are, the laity, or who the laity are as priests, who the laity are as prophets, and who the laity are as kings, I think this is going to mean a lot more for us, right? An easy way to remember it. The prophetic, we know it, right? We know the faith, right? Kingly, we do it. We do the faith, right? Prophetic, we know it, we proclaim it. Kingly, we do it. And priestly, we offer it, right? So we're called as Christians, we're called as Catholics to know, to do, and to offer, right? Every one of us, by our baptism, are called to know, do, and offer everything that is there in our faith, right? So I hope, so for us, we're gonna do something that that reporter was hoping that Father Arupe would do, and I think Father Arupe answered beautifully. We are going to do our best to get as practical as we can about knowing, doing, and offering the faith. So to next week, we're going to dive into what the mission looks like. Particularly, we're going to focus on what's some mission fields that we find ourselves. What's some mission fields that the layperson finds himself in, and how is it that we're supposed to kind of navigate that? So I hope you enjoyed. Enjoyed the session. I hope you enjoyed being with us this morning. Thank you so much. If you know somebody that needs that, hey, you just think needs to hear this, or wants to that you think would be interested by diving into this teaching, you can hit the share button. You can share with them you can share with them the playlist on YouTube, anything like that. But thank y'all so much for being with us. Just a quick reminder, at St. Hilary and St. Anthony, we're going to have confessions today from 4 to 5 in St. Hilary Church, and then we'll have Mass live streaming at 5:15. We're going to celebrate the memorial of St. Louis de Montfort today. He happens to be one of the patron saints of one of our seminarians, Zach, or our seminarian applicant, Zach, who's living here today, who's living here at St. Hilary, and he asked personal favor, so absolutely, we're going to celebrate some St. Louis de Montfort, true devotion to our Blessed Mother, and all those good things. So I hope this was beautiful. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I've been trying to keep an eye on our comments. I see some thank yous. I see some people join in. I saw Miss Kathy was very, very excited about hearing about the kingdom of God we have waiting for us. But I really appreciate you being with us. Share, like, all those good things, and we will see you this afternoon. Next week, 10 a.m. on Tuesday, we will have our 5th session, Theology of the Laity mission. So thank you so much. God bless you, and be well.